Did you know that behind the warmth and laughter of the Golden Girls were lives touched by illness, grief, and quiet heartbreak? For millions of viewers, the show felt like comfort, a place where sharp humor and friendship made everything seem lighter. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the reality behind several of those familiar faces was far more fragile than the sitcom ever revealed. Some became television legends. Others appeared only briefly, yet still left a lasting mark. What united them was not just fame, but the deeply human struggles they carried beyond the screen. In this video, we are looking back at 8 memorable names from the Golden Girls and the bittersweet stories they left behind. By the time Rue McClanahan appeared as Blanche Devereaux, she did not just look like the kind of woman who could steal a room. She understood exactly how that kind of woman survived in it. Blanche was glamorous, flirtatious, and almost impossible to ignore. But what made the performance last was the way Rue gave all that confidence a pulse. Beneath the teasing smile and southern charm, there was always the feeling that Blanche needed attention, not only because she enjoyed it, but because silence might have forced her to sit alone with herself. That tension made the role feel bigger than a sitcom character. To viewers, Blanche was the one who could turn embarrassment into comedy and loneliness into seduction before anyone noticed the difference. Rue played her with such ease that it was tempting to believe the actress and the character were equally fearless. But off-screen, her life carried the kind of instability the series could only hint at from a distance. Her romantic life was often as turbulent as the one audiences laughed at on television. She went through multiple marriages, public heartbreak, and the emotional wear that comes from repeatedly hoping love will finally settle into something dependable. Later, she also faced breast cancer, a battle that forced her to confront the fragility of the body that Hollywood had always expected women to preserve. Even then, she kept working, kept showing up, and kept projecting the same spark that made Blanche feel larger than life. That may be the saddest part of Rue McClanahan's story. The woman who made desire look effortless was, in many ways, still navigating disappointment, reinvention, and survival behind the scenes. Her death in 2010, following a stroke and cerebral hemorrhage, felt like the loss of more than an actress. It felt like the end of a certain kind of television confidence, one built on wit, sensuality, and emotional nerve. Blanche Devereaux may have been written as the boldest woman in the room, but Rue McClanahan made her unforgettable by revealing, just beneath the polish, how badly even the most dazzling people still want to be loved. There was something almost disarming about the way this character could deliver cruelty, wisdom, and affection in the same breath. Small in stature but impossible to overlook, Sophia Petrillo never needed to raise her voice to take control of a scene. One look, one cutting remark, one perfectly timed pause, and the entire rhythm of the room belonged to her. That was the genius of the role. She was funny, yes, but she also felt like someone who had lived long enough to stop pretending for anyone. What made that performance so memorable was the sense that Sophia had earned every word she spoke. She was not written as a fragile old woman fading into the background. She was the opposite of that. She was alert, defiant, and often the only person willing to say exactly what everyone else was trying to avoid. The irony, of course, was that the actress behind her had to work hard to create that illusion of age. Estelle Getty was actually younger than B. Arthur, who played her daughter, which meant each appearance required a carefully built transformation through wigs, makeup, posture, and precision. Away from the laughter, the reality was far less effortless. Long before success arrived, Estelle had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, coming from a poor immigrant family and working ordinary jobs while trying to keep an acting dream alive. Her breakthrough came late, and even after fame found her, performance never became completely easy. She struggled with intense stage fright and memory issues, private burdens that stood in painful contrast to the confidence audiences saw on screen. The woman delivering those razor-sharp punchlines was carrying fears of her own the entire time. That is what makes her story hit differently. Sophia seemed built to outlast anything. Yet Estelle's final years were overshadowed by Lewy body dementia, an illness that slowly eroded the very sharpness that had made her so unforgettable. When she died in 2008, the loss felt heavier than most sitcom farewells, because it meant saying goodbye to a woman who had made old age look fearless. What remains so moving about that performance is not just the humor, but the contradiction behind it. Sophia Petrillo sounded like someone who had mastered life, while Estelle Getty reminded us how much courage it can take just to keep showing up. Not every presence on the Golden Girls needed to be loud to matter. Some characters arrived more gently, almost as if they were stepping into a world already in motion and trying not to disturb it. That was the quiet strength Miles Weber brought to the series. He was not written as the flashiest man in the room, nor the funniest, nor the most chaotic. What made him memorable was something rarer than that. He felt steady. In a show filled with sharp edges and larger-than-life personalities, Miles carried the kind of calm that made Rose's world feel a little safer. That calm, of course, was only part of the appeal. There was also warmth in the way Harold Gould played him, a softness that never slipped into weakness. He understood how to make decency interesting. With just a look or a slight hesitation, he could suggest thoughtfulness, restraint, even a loneliness that sat quietly beneath the surface. It made the character feel lived in rather than simply written. Viewers did not just see Rose with a love interest. They saw the possibility of tenderness surviving later in life, which gave those scenes a special kind of emotional pull. The life behind that performance had its own discipline and difficulty. Before the camera ever made him familiar, Harold Gould served in World War II, endured harsh conditions overseas, and later built an unusually intellectual path for an actor by earning a doctorate in theater. That background gave him a grounded seriousness, but it did not spare him from struggle. Early Hollywood was not easy on him. Like many respected actors of his generation, he took side jobs, waited for better roles, and worked longer than most audiences ever realize before becoming truly recognizable. The success looked smooth once it arrived, yet it had been earned the hard way. His final chapter carried a more private sadness. Harold Gould died in 2010 from complications related to prostate cancer, and with him went a kind of screen presence that has grown rarer over time. Thoughtful, mature, and deeply human without ever demanding attention. Maybe that is why Miles still lingers in memory. He did not need spectacle to leave an impression. Through Harold Gould, he became proof that gentleness, especially in a world built on noise, can sometimes be the most moving thing of all. Betty White made Rose Nyland work because she knew exactly how to play innocence without making it feel foolish. She gave the character warmth, timing, and emotional honesty, which turned Rose into far more than the sweet one in the group. On paper, that kind of role could have faded into the background beside bigger personalities like Dorothy, Blanche, and Sophia. But Betty made sure Rose never disappeared. She made her funny, lovable, and unexpectedly moving, which is why Rose became one of the emotional anchors of the Golden Girls, instead of just its comic relief. That success came from control, not simplicity. Betty understood that Rose was most effective when her softness felt genuine rather than exaggerated. A streak Olaf's story could land as a joke, but the expression behind it still had to feel sincere. A naive remark could trigger laughter, but it also had to reveal kindness, empathy, and trust. That balance is what made the performance last. Rose was not just there to be the innocent one. She often reminded everyone else, and the audience too, that gentleness has its own kind of intelligence. Off-screen, that brightness existed beside a life that had known disappointment and grief. Betty built a career across decades in an industry that often made aging a quiet punishment for women, yet she kept adapting, kept working, and kept finding new generations of viewers. She had already lived through the Great Depression, years of career pressure, and the death of her husband, Alan Ludden, whose loss marked her deeply. She never remarried, and that detail adds another layer to the warmth people saw in her. The woman who gave so much comfort on screen understood absence in a very personal way. That is part of why the performance still feels so alive. Betty White did not just play kindness as a personality trait. She played it as something conscious, something chosen by a person who already knew life could hurt. When she died on the 31st of December 2021, just short of turning 100, audiences did not only lose a beloved actress, they lost someone who had made optimism feel credible for generations. Rose Nyland remained memorable because Betty White understood the role completely. She knew that in a world full of louder characters, the one who stays gentle can sometimes leave the deepest mark. Some television characters are written to be loved right away. Stanley Zbornak was never one of them. He annoyed people, embarrassed himself, made the same mistakes over and over, and somehow still kept finding his way back through Dorothy's front door. What made that work was Herb Edelman. He understood that a man like Stanley could not be played as a simple joke. He had to feel like someone viewers had actually met before, the ex-husband who always arrived with excuses, charm, bad timing, and just enough vulnerability to stop himself from becoming completely unbearable. That is what made the performance land. Stanley was selfish, careless, and often absurd, but Herb gave him a human awkwardness that made him feel real. He never pushed the character so far that the audience stopped believing in him. Instead, he let Stanley move through scenes like a man forever trying to talk his way out of consequences he had absolutely earned. That choice gave the comedy more bite. People laughed at Stanley, but they also understood Dorothy's frustration because the character felt painfully recognizable. There is something fitting about that, because Herb Edelman's own life did not unfold in a smooth or glamorous line either. Before acting fully took hold, he moved through other paths, including veterinary school, taxi driving, and hotel management. Even later, when his face became familiar to television audiences, stability still came with strain. He dealt with divorce, fatherhood, and a serious lung condition tied to years of smoking. Behind the comic timing was a man dealing with a body that was becoming harder to ignore. He died in 1996 from complications of emphysema, and the loss carried a quieter kind of sadness. Not every performer leaves behind a grand myth. Some leave something subtler but just as lasting, the memory of a face, a rhythm, a flaw played so honestly that it still feels true years later. That is probably why Stanley remains easy to remember. He was messy, frustrating, and rarely admirable. But Herb Edelman knew exactly how to make that kind of man feel painfully, almost uncomfortably alive. No one on the Golden Girls held a scene quite the way Dorothy Zbornak did. She did not need glamour, softness, or exaggerated charm to command attention. What made her stand out was control. Dorothy could shut down nonsense with a glance, cut through chaos with one line, and make exhaustion sound funnier than most characters could make excitement. B. Arthur understood that kind of presence perfectly. She played Dorothy as a woman who had run out of patience long ago, yet still kept showing up for the people around her, which is exactly why the role became so beloved. That performance worked because Bea never chased sympathy too hard. Dorothy was intelligent, sarcastic, and often emotionally guarded, but she was never cold. Beneath the dry delivery was a woman carrying disappointment, responsibility, and the kind of weariness that comes from being the adult in every room. Bea let all of that sit quietly under the comedy. She knew Dorothy did not need to explain herself to feel real. A pause, a stare, a line delivered half under her breath, could reveal more than a dramatic speech ever would. There was something fitting about that restraint, because B. Arthur's own life had been shaped by discipline long before television made her famous. She served in the Marine Corps during World War II, then built a career that demanded toughness, precision, and a willingness to take on material that was not always safe or flattering. Success came, but it did not erase loneliness, difficult personal chapters, or the emotional distance she was often said to carry. Even in fame, she remained someone who seemed to protect part of herself from easy access, which only makes Dorothy feel more truthful in retrospect. Her final years were shadowed by lung cancer, and when she died in 2009, the loss felt especially sharp because Dorothy had always seemed like the one person in that house who could keep everything standing. She was the center of gravity, the woman who rolled her eyes at the madness but still stayed in the room. What B. Arthur left behind was bigger than sarcasm or wit. Through Dorothy Zabornak, she created a portrait of strength that did not need to announce itself. It simply endured, and that may be why her absence still feels so noticeable. For some actresses, Hollywood opens the door and then spends years trying to decide what to do with them. That was part of the story here. Long before she appeared on The Golden Girls, Sheree North had already lived through the strange burden of being introduced to the industry as a possible replacement for someone as iconic as Marilyn Monroe. It was the kind of comparison that brought attention fast, but it also came with pressure, scrutiny, and the risk of being remembered more for an image than for the work itself. By the time she appeared as Virginia Hollingsworth, she carried none of the desperation of someone still trying to prove she belonged. What came through instead was polish, control, and the ease of an actress who had survived enough disappointment to stop performing for approval. Even in a smaller role, there was something composed about her presence. She did not need much screen time to suggest a full life behind the character. That is often the mark of a seasoned performer. A scene stops feeling written and starts feeling inhabited. The road that shaped that kind of presence was not smooth. Early in her career, Sheree North was pushed into a studio system eager to mold her into a marketable symbol, which often meant being measured against expectations she did not create. When that vision failed to fully take hold, she had to rebuild through persistence rather than fantasy. There were rejections, shifting opportunities, health battles, and the emotional weight of moving through an industry that is often kinder to image than endurance. She also faced personal pain, including repeated struggles with illness and the losses that accumulate quietly over a long career. That is why her later work carries a different kind of dignity. It is not the flash of someone arriving. It is the steadiness of someone who stayed. Sheree North died in 2005 from complications after surgery, and her passing closed the life of an actress who had spent decades adapting, surviving, and continuing to work long after the first version of Hollywood had moved on from her. There is something deeply moving about that kind of legacy. Not everyone becomes a permanent headline, but some people leave behind something harder to fake. In Sheree North's case, it was resilience, the ability to keep turning up with grace even after the spotlight had stopped promising anything. For viewers who grew up with classic television, there is a certain kind of face that brings back a whole era the moment it appears. Nancy Walker had that kind of presence. Even before she said a word, she could make a scene feel familiar, as if she belonged to the world of old sitcoms, stage comedy, and sharp television timing that audiences once returned to week after week. That is part of what made her appearance in The Golden Girls so memorable. She did not need much time on screen to leave the impression of someone instantly recognizable. What made that impression last was the control behind it. By the time she appeared as Angela, Nancy Walker was already carrying the confidence of a seasoned performer who understood exactly how to shape a moment. Her comedy was never noisy for the sake of being noticed. It came from precision. A pause, a glance, a line delivered with perfect weight could shift the energy of a scene without looking forced. That kind of skill often feels effortless to the audience, which is exactly why it is so easy to underestimate. She made a supporting role feel complete, and that is something only experienced performers really know how to do. Behind that ease, though, was a life shaped by long discipline and quieter hardships. Coming from a vaudeville family meant performance was part of her world from early on, but that kind of beginning did not spare her from struggle. Over time, she faced health issues, personal loss, and the emotional wear that can follow a life spent working in entertainment. Even so, she continued showing up with the same professionalism and steadiness that made her such a dependable presence. There is something quietly sad in that contrast. Audiences remember the laughter and the familiarity, but rarely the private weight that may have existed behind them. When Nancy Walker died in 1992 from lung cancer, it marked the loss of a performer whose legacy was built on craft rather than spectacle. She was not someone who needed chaos to be remembered. What she left behind was something subtler and, in many ways, more lasting. Maybe that is why her presence still feels easy to picture. Nancy Walker belonged to the kind of television memory that stays warm long after the screen has gone dark. What made the Golden Girls so lasting was never just the comedy. It was the feeling that these people, in all their sharpness, warmth, flaws, and sadness, still belonged to one another. Looking back now, that is what makes these stories hit even harder. Behind the laughter were lives shaped by illness, disappointment, resilience, and quiet heartbreak that the audience rarely saw. And maybe that is why these performances still matter. They were funny, yes, but they were also human. Time has taken many of the faces, but not the feeling they left behind. Which story stayed with you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoy this kind of bittersweet look back at television history, subscribe and stay close for the next story.